You ever been in a police lineup before? Yeah, me neither. Maybe 6 or 7 odd times. Have you ever wondered how accurate that is? Hold on a second. A lot of times people come in and they're under extreme duress trying to pick a person out of a lineup from 5, 6, 7 odd different people. And it may not be accurate at all. Hold on. Because a lot of things are going on in their mind. A lot of different situations. It might be pitch blackout. They may not have actually even seen their faces, but maybe just a weapon or the place where they're at. Maybe it's so traumatic. Speaking of, we got Dr. Mario Baldassari on the podcast today to talk to us about memory and police lineups. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the show, Dr. Mario Baldassari. That's Italian for he who wears high pants or something like that. What is it?
It's probably, best of my knowledge, descendant of the African King Balthazar who visited Jesus in the manger.
That is a lot better story
Yeah.
than I thought you were going to give me. I thought it was just going to be...
I looked it up. I was curious.
Is that right?
Probably, who knows, really, but that's supposedly, there's a lot of variations of the last name, and they all come back to somebody at some point who either name themselves after him or...
That's impressive.
Yeah, that's right. I have apparently very deep royal lineage. No.
I like
cut
that.
This out.
That's an impressive... I think we're done with the show. That's enough right there. We just cut. You got your PhD, University of Victoria 2017, in cognition and brain sciences, with your research based in memory. Now, is that the kind of memory we're talking about? You lose your car keys, or you forget to put on your wedding ring when you go out with your buddies to the bars every other time you're out. We talking about that kind of memory, or what are we talking about?
That second one probably has something else going on in it.
That's a whole different element.
But what you say is interesting, because people do, whenever they ask me about this or about what I do in general, think about when their memory fails them, which is, I think, the part of it that's compelling to all of us. But it's also maybe a misconception of what it really is, because it works great most of the time. And so every now and then there's a situation where things are unfamiliar or something's presented to us in a strange way where we kind of have a misfire and something doesn't quite click in memory-wise, and we lose track of what's going on. And yeah, that's those are the things we notice, because partially they're odd, so they're distinctive, which makes them more memorable, sort of oddly and a little bit ironically. But most of the time, our memory does exactly what it's meant to do. It works very well. For example, you drove here today.
Yes.
Did you make any errors along the way in your driving? Did you make any wrong turns? Do you even remember the drive?
I have. I take a left onto a road and drive down here and take a right.
Okay, so
I don't have a lot of
wrong mistakes to make.
No.
But you didn't run over anything.
Any people?
You didn't go, or animals, or
garbage
even, probably.
I missed an old possum, or is it just possum?
Yeah, both are fine. I've looked that up before.
Right. Well, one's here in the United States and one here is like in Australia.
Yeah.
I can't remember which is which. I missed one that was already on the road.
Okay.
That had been deceased.
Right.
But I went out of my way not to hit it.
So all of that is your memory functioning perfectly. You remembered how to get here. You remembered how your car works. You remembered exactly how much to turn the wheel to avoid the possum.
I do.
And so on and so on. All that is memory working as it's supposed to. It's just that when it misfires is that kind of when we notice it. A good metaphor is your car. You get in your car, you drive to work, you use it for whatever you're doing. You don't really think about it. But when it breaks down and you have to take it in to get fixed, you're like, this stupid car. And it's a frustrating and very different experience.
You
And
forgot
so,
it just ran 200,000 miles without an oil change.
well, so your car is exempt from this
It's a
rule,
really
maybe.
good car.
But in general, it's this. The metaphor is we don't really notice something when it works just fine, and it sort of pops into our consciousness when it stops working.
So how does your memory fail? If you had something that was going on and you said, I really need to remember what's going on. Like, for example, my wife will tell me, I need you to get these 4 or 5 different items from the store. And so instead of very easily writing it down, putting it on my cell phone, or tattooing it on my wrist, I just remember the number 4 or 5, whatever the number is.
Okay.
And then I try to struggle through to figure out what it is. It's like a little game.
Sure.
And most of the time I forget something. So why is it, even though I know how much it is, I know what she said, somehow this thing just failed me?
There's probably 2 reasons I can think of. The first is prospective memory is really hard. It's maybe the hardest type, and that's the kind of memory where we're trying to remember to do something later. So this is why, for example, for older adults, remembering to take your daily pills is really tough, and why people have such careful setups to make sure they take the right pills the right days. Because remembering that stuff is hard. You talked about forgetting your keys or something. Like grabbing something on the way out is a really tough thing to remember, because trying to remember ahead of the moment, trying to say like, okay, when this moment hits, I need to remember to do this thing, is a hard task. The other piece of trying to remember a short grocery list is probably that you have tried to remember hundreds of grocery lists in your life. Let's say.
I would say so.
Maybe more, and maybe into the thousands as we go more and more often. But, depending on if you go once a week or 3 times. Anyway, the process of trying to remember, okay, this time I need milk, eggs, and bread, and, strawberries, because they're in season, is it's going to be hard to remember milk, eggs, and bread probably, because you need them every time or almost every time.
Strawberries a standout.
I would say in that example, strawberries stand out. If you think strawberries are really good right now, I'm going to go get them, then that might stick out. But if you've got 4 other things that you always kind of maybe need, and you're trying to remember, do I need this thing this time or not, it's hard to keep that straight. So uniqueness is a big feature of what makes something memorable. The word we use is distinctiveness in the research.
Okay.
But when something is common, when something is regular, we don't really. It makes it harder to remember, because it's harder to retrieve that thing from our storage banks. So another way to think of this is, let's see. You could I'm thinking of a metaphor that might not quite. It would take too long, I think, to.
So you're
describe,
thinking
but
about right now, or are you actually trying to remember? Because this is the
I'm deciding
irony
between
in this.
I'm
I see
deciding
what you're
between
saying.
2
I
things,
see what you're
which is related. All of this falls under the umbrella of cognition, which is essentially a process of efficiency and pattern recognition. So our minds at all times are attempting to come to the most accurate and fastest conclusion they can about what's going on around us, to help us make decisions or do whatever we most want to do in that moment. So when a moment is odd, or when a situation is described to us in a way that it's never been described before, we have trouble locking into our usual processes and recognizing patterns in the situation, because it's too new to us.
What about something, when I was a kid, let's see, I was born in 1970, and there was a lot of things that came up about subliminal things, your memories and stuff that you may not have actually seen, but you don't know. My wife and I, not to disparage her, because this is a more of an interesting story than anything, we're watching a TV show, I think it's on TLC or History, it's called Brain Games. Keegan-Michael Key, I think, is a host now. And it was a really good episode. And usually they have some sort of magic trick on there. They're showing how to fool your mind and what you think, preconceived notions. And it had something that was going on, and it kept showing pictures throughout the entire thing. And at the very end, the guy said, now, I want you to think real hard about this. I sure am thirsty. To answer this question, I sure am thirsty I sure could use a tall, cold glass of, and my wife, out of the blue, said, milk. Now, the strange thing about that, I said water, but the first thing in my mind was also milk.
Mm.
And so I looked over at her and we laughed about it. Then the guy explained to us, have you noticed all the milk references throughout the entire show?
Oh.
Now, I didn't. And there was even, as he said that, there was a milk sign right behind him as he was saying that line. That's not something that I knew. I didn't consciously know that. But
Yeah.
somehow or another, I registered that
Yep.
as part of my memory, that I remembered all those seeing that throughout that.
Yeah.
Is that am I insane? Or have we lost our minds
You
watching
are,
a show like that?
Your memory is working exactly as it should. So that is the way I think of memory is as a network. So if you're a computer scientist, that sort of makes immediate sense to you. But if you're not, the idea is that every memory and maybe even every element of memories are connected to one another, and those connections are forged by being used together. So imagine, what can we imagine? A series of, imagine a spider web, let's say, and all the spots where the different strings of the spider web cross are sort of like nodes, individual pieces of information. Maybe you have a pizza node, and maybe you have a node that is your wife, and you have a node that is that has references to pizza toppings, and then maybe you've got a Pizza King node. And if you lit up all those nodes at the same time, you'd remember a time that you and your wife went to the Pizza King, if that's ever happened.
Yeah.
Following from that, if you think about your wife and pizza, you might also think about the Pizza King because you've been there together before.
That makes sense.
So what they were doing is activating milk for you. They were pounding on the milk node in your mind throughout the show, so that it was hot, it was active, it had a lot of stimulation. And so the idea then is that as soon as I ask you to say something related to a drink you might have, milk is probably going to come up because you've been thinking about milk, maybe subconsciously, maybe consciously in and out, but not really noticing it all that often throughout the last half hour. So
You didn't notice.
So milk pops in.
Because that's the weird thing about this. Now, I'm a milk drinker. I know a lot of people can't drink, and I don't think my wife ever drinks milk for any reason. And I don't know if she's lactose intolerant or whatever, or just isn't her beverage of choice. Not sure which one.
Okay.
But for her to say that, and she looked at me really weird, and she goes, I don't know why I said that. And that's just crazy that I would say that because I don't want one.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings me to, a lot of your research has a lot to do with eyewitness testimony, eyewitness, especially as it relates to crimes, correct? Whatever got you interested in that?
Well, I was sort of, for lack of a better word, I was activated in college by memory as a research idea and concept, and in class. I took a bunch of different intro classes my first year in college and second year, and I dragged out choosing a major as long as I could, and I found psychology, and I said, ooh, I think this kind of applies to everything. And then I got a mentor who was his name is Matt Kelly, who's really interested, who is a memory researcher, and Matt got me looking into memory and doing projects in memory, and I said, well, this applies to everything too. Everyone has memory, and memory influences every single moment of every day for every person.
Right.
Memory is what forms the stream of consciousness we feel like we're living. I later learned that process of thinking what you're learning about applies to everything is kind of the process of finding a research passion, for lack of a better way to say it.
Makes sense.
When I talked to other grad students in grad school, everybody said, "Oh, well, my project could save the world," literally. And I would say, like, "Well, but you're reading about, I can't think of a good. You're reading about ancient history in a region of the world that's like the other side from here. Why?
Right.
How could that affect me today?" And they're like, "No, it really could, and here's why." So I think that's just what research passion or research interest, deep interest looks like. So anyway, I got into all those things, but what really moved me about memory was that everyday application type research where people are finding out something that can help a person tomorrow. And so I got into a lab for grad school where they were doing that kind of work, and everything kind of came together from there. I did a bunch. I'm very interested in general in applied memory. I think about memory in the classroom all the time. I'm interested in questions like consolidation of memories during sleep, but where I have worked the most heavily is indeed that area of eyewitness memory and then false memory, sort of adjacent to there, and that's it's an area where psychology has had a larger effect on real world practice than I think almost any other place, certainly any other place within memory and probably within cognition research, because we've generated a lot of really important findings that police have actually taken on and used. And so it's a really exciting area to be in, because it's not hard to imagine if you come up with a really excellent idea or some useful new procedure that police might actually be interested in taking it up, because they want to be better at their jobs, and police are a group who seem in general to be interested in this sort of process. And so a lot of folks I know have partnerships with local police where they develop questions together, and that's something that as a relatively new arrival at USF I want to keep working on locally. But it's
So if you have a person that comes in,
yeah,
I'm a victim of a crime of some kind, passion or otherwise.
sure,
But who hasn't been a victim of passion every day? If you walk in and you say, I'm pretty sure I can identify this person. You got, 5, 6, 7 odd people in a lineup. Can there be inaccuracies? Can there be a time where somebody chooses somebody and says, I'm 100% sure, but they are really not at all sure?
Ooh. So there's kind of 3 questions in your question. Yes, people can be wrong. Yes, people can be wrong about how confident they should be, but generally people are not too wrong about how confident they should be. So they are, let's see. Yes, absolutely, people are wrong all the time. Not all the time, I shouldn't say it that way. People are often wrong. And we are often a little overconfident in that task because we have the experience of, kind of like what you and I were talking about earlier, remembering each other's faces just fine all the time. When you've seen somebody before, when you've had a conversation with them, we are pretty awesome at encoding and then remembering and recognizing each other's faces, because it's a memory stimulus we use ourselves all the time.
Isn't it something that's really ingrained as a child? They say that babies can recognize their mother and or father like this out of a group of people. That recognition is incredible. So if you're born with that, you use it all the time, where does it fail?
It fails because it takes us some time to truly meaningfully encode somebody else's face. So there's this other side to this whole question, which is that faces are all pretty darn similar. Everybody's face has the same general shape, unless they have an injury or something like that. They have the same general features, right? So people look pretty similar. We all have this. So it makes it a kind of interesting memory challenge, which is tell apart all these different stimuli that have all the same features on them. It's not the same as telling a truck from a car. It's like telling 5 different BMW 3 Series from each other or something. So because that's an example I show in class. So it has this kind of deceptive element to us where it feels really easy because we do it all the time. And there's maybe kind of an aha moment when you do definitely recognize somebody, and that it feels so good to us that we maybe lean into it when we shouldn't. But the main reason people lose track of their memories of criminals is because in an eyewitnessing situation, you see the person usually for a split second, and then they're gone, and you maybe don't even see their face in full pointed right at you. And you certainly are very likely not interacting with them. even if you are, there are all kinds of other things that make memory a little more wobbly in that situation. So there's a really well-known effect called the weapon focus effect. So if a criminal has a weapon in a situation, you're looking at the weapon because you want to make sure it's not pointed at you if it's a gun.
The face is really incidental in this case.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, we naturally are drawn to each other's faces for the most part, and some people might have the feeling of, well, I know I'm in this situation, and so I should memorize him in case I need to identify him later. But some of my recent research shows that even that process of thinking doesn't really help people. We can think, I want to memorize his face, but we don't have a good intuitive sense of how we memorize each other's faces. Because when we naturally memorize each other's faces, we aren't really consciously thinking about it, and we are, it turns out, absorbing each other's faces holistically. But when you tell someone to memorize somebody else's face, they zoom in on individual features. So if I was trying to memorize you, I would go, okay, he's got those glasses, and I would look at your nose and try to remember the shape of it, and maybe see like the exact shape of your beard or your mouth, or find a feature that stands out maybe,
Yeah.
or try to think about the features individually. But when I'm just talking to you, I'm looking at your face, and I'm not looking and zooming into those individual things, and that is a better process for memorization of faces, it turns out. So we call that holistic versus part or featural recognition in faces.
That's the weird thing about that. I've always wondered that about in Superman.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Superman, who's got the hair curl
Yeah,
predominantly.
yeah.
You go to Clark Kent, he's got glasses.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody thinks that's the most insane disguise that there ever was. But the reality of it is, if you've ever known somebody your entire existence and they always have glasses on,
Right.
and then they take their glasses off, it looks like an
Looks
entirely weird, different person. They look like a mole person or
Yeah.
some sort of possum again. The one probably I avoided running over again
Right.
recently,
Right.
this morning. They look like an entirely different person.
Yeah.
And even when they don't wear their glasses and they say, I'm going to go to contacts, you can almost not get past the fact that they don't have the glasses anymore. That's how I know you. It's so ingrained in my
Sure,
memory.
yeah. Or think about like when you're a kid and you see your teacher at the grocery store, and you're like, who is that? Like, you
That's-
can't even quite comprehend,
That's terrible.
but it's hard to recognize sometimes.
It is. They're
And it's
outside their element.
They're similar things. So the first is an example of like a change in appearance, and the other is a change in context. But to answer your Superman thought, disguises work. The research backs this up. Disguises work really well, and that's another reason eyewitnesses can be inaccurate. As soon as somebody changes their appearance in a big, meaningful way, it can be really difficult to recognize them, especially if you've only seen them for a few seconds at a time.
Especially under extreme duress as well.
Yeah. So the issue of stress is interesting. For the most part, the amount of stress arousal people experience in witnessing scenarios is an amount that's sort of in a Goldilocks zone where memory is still good and maybe even a little better sometimes. And then it's not till you get to really extreme situations of stress and trauma that people start to block memories and lose the ability to recognize perpetrators. So, like, you know, when people are victims and the crime is particularly awful, then it can be hard to pull that person to memorize and remember accurately. But there's also really famous examples of intentional memorization there that led to errors. So one of the most, an example that comes up in my research circles all the time is the case of Ronald Cotton, who was falsely imprisoned on a rape charge because the victim identified him from a lineup and was certain that is the guy. I memorized him at the time. I was conscious of it, and that's exactly what he looks like. So Ronald Cotton went to prison, and in prison he met and was often confused for a guy named Bobby Poole, and they would people called each of them by each other's names because they looked so similar, and later Bobby Poole confessed to that crime, to that rape. And so that's maybe an odd situation where two guys just happen to look really, really similar. But it's possible to make errors even when we intentionally memorize, even when we have those sort of arousing levels of stress that might aid some of memory. Like we were saying before, the memory is going to be awfully distinctive, right? Unless you're someone who witnesses crimes quite often, which is possible too. But for a lot of folks, witnessing a crime is going to be a rare event. So it makes sense that it should stick out. So all these things, I think, suggest to us that we should be able to remember a criminal from a witnessing situation.
Ronald Cotton get out of prison then?
He did get out, yes, and now he tours with her name is Jen. I can't think of her last name. They wrote a book together. They do speaking engagements together,
Wow.
talking about eyewitness misidentification and all that kind of stuff.
You talk about in a lot of your research a couple different ways to enhance the ability to help people during these times when you're going through it. You obviously have a lot of things going on.
Yeah.
You're second guessing yourself. There's a stress of it. I don't want to see this person again.
Yeah.
I don't want to see them to begin with.
Sure.
And there's a lot of things going on. You talk about different ways in your research of trying to put experiments in place that would help them out. Help them out. Can you talk a little bit about that? What you think might be a better way to help people remember more accurately? Because remember, there's people's lives on the line here.
Yeah.
If they're misidentified, that's a real problem. That's a severe problem. So
Yeah.
how can we make this more accurate?
If I had that answer, you and I would be doing a TED Talk and an NPR podcast and all kinds of stuff. So
I wouldn't be involved.
Well,
They wouldn't have to.
but if what I'm saying is that's the answer we are all reaching for. Absolutely, everyone in my sort of subfield of psychology is trying to figure out: is there a way to make people more accurate in this situation? Is there a way we can get a sense of who might or might not be accurate in a given situation? So to go back to the original question you posed, is you mentioned confidence. Mm-hmm. So when people make an identification, their confidence is generally meaningful. So the finding is that about 90% of the people who say they're 90% confident are right. And about 50% of the people who say they are 50% confident are right. And about 10% and so on. So it's reasonably linear in that way. The problem is, how do you tell, So if you've got somebody who says, yeah, I'm 70% confident, well, how do you tell if they're in the 70 that is correct or the 30 that's not? It's kind of hard to take that finding and apply it to practice. But in general, confidence is fairly meaningful. So like the takeaway, I think, would be if you have a witness and they pick someone out of a lineup and they say, yeah, I'm like 100%, 99% confident, they're probably right. In general, we have a sense for when we're making a mistake in those situations. But the problem is, if a witness says, I'm 90% confident, then the opposing lawyer in the courtroom will attack that 10%, right? So
because it's enough.
Yes, and so police are a little reticent to take confidence ratings in I shouldn't speak for all police, of course, but in most of the conversations I've had and folks I've talked with, they bring up this very clear issue of cross-examination at trial.
How can we make them more accurate?
How do we make people more accurate? Right. A lot of folks have looked into different ways of doing the task. So the traditional lineup, right, is there's 6 photos in front of you and you try to pick the guy from the photos.
Right.
One way to make sure people are more accurate is to not have a biased lineup. So in historical examples, there are very obviously biased lineups where there's only one person in the lineup who matches the description of the perpetrator. So let's say the perpetrator had a mustache and only one person in the lineup has a mustache. Well, it's pretty obvious who the police think is the guy in that lineup. So avoiding that situation helps people be more accurate as witnesses. Other sort of simple kind of almost experimental control kind of issues really come into play. So giving people really clear instructions, making sure that the witness knows they have an option to say, I don't see him at all, and reject the lineup if they feel that that's the case. Encouraging them to be accurate if they can, but reject it if they don't see him. Collecting confidence ratings. All these kinds of things are things that make our use of the witness's decision more accurate. But you can't really make a witness more or less accurate. They have the memory they have, and they have the willingness to pick somebody that they have internally. So those are, that willingness to pick seems to be a stable internal trait. Some people are pickers and some people are not. And then how much memory, how good a quality their memory is, has to do with all the factors of the situation when it happened. How far were they from the criminal? How long were they exposed to him? How dark or light was it at the time? How stressed were they? Was there a weapon? And so on and so on. So one way maybe that I've been working on over a longer period of time to try to figure out which witnesses are more or less likely to be accurate is to build a big measure, imagine like a sort of big mathematical function in which you enter in all those variables I just listed about the situation, and then some variables about the witness themselves too. So how accurate are they typically in their confidence ratings? Are they a person who has a good sense of how accurate their memory is? Are they a picker or not? Are they somebody who's really good at faces or not? Because there is variation there. There's variability. Some people are great at faces. There's a super recognizer unit in the Scottish police of people who comb through footage and pick out criminals when they see them from close from CCTV and stuff. Yeah, really interesting. There's all kinds of news stories if you Google that, the super recognizer unit.
Super recognizer.
And then there's the other end of that spectrum too. There's people with prosopagnosia who can't remember anyone else's face. It's a very specific kind of
I've
agnosia.
heard that.
Yeah.
You hear these little shows on Discovery Channel, whatever comes up, and they have somebody that's like, I couldn't pick a person's face out of my own husband, my own wife, something like that.
Well, it's a famous, in my cognitive neuroscience class, we read The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. And he details in that the titular story is a guy who has very clear and deep prosopagnosia to the point where, he tries in the examination room, he tries to take his wife's head off with his hand and put it on his head because he thinks, oh, that's my hat on a hat rack.
We've all tried it. Prosopagnosia. Let me get a spelling on that.
P-R-O.
Yeah, I've given up already. I don't worry about that.
It sounds just like it's said.
It doesn't sound right to me at all.
But the fact that there is a top and a bottom suggests that there's a middle there and a range. And so some people are going to be decent at faces, some will be not quite so, and there's probably an average somewhere. So that's kind of that's a project I'm excited to get back going this fall, actually, with some students, is a measure of how good are you at faces, and will that enable me to predict how good you will be at this eyewitnessing task.
You talked about bias, and you're talking about bias in a lot of ways with the lineup. Do we have our own biases ourselves? That we can come in? What is that, and how does that guide your decision making?
So there's a whole world of biases out there, especially when you start to get into social cognition and what biases people might have about who is and isn't a criminal. There's studies on who looks more like a criminal to people.
Like our producer, John, looks like a villain.
I think that's a facial hair-based stereotype that you have. He's got the sort of turned
oddly
up
enough, both
mustache.
of you kind of look very similar.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying you do. I don't saying anything villain-wise, but
Okay.
I don't look like a villain, do I?
You're like the guy behind the villain.
Yeah, I'll take Puppet Master.
Yeah, they call
All
up
day
to
long,
you
right?
and you go yes, and make sure.
I'm more of a steepled finger.
Yeah. Okay. So
Evil.
when you're following through on my plan, make sure you also hurt the environment somehow.
Somehow. Throw that in there. Because if you think about the steepled finger concept
I stole that joke, by the way. That's not my joke.
from, I appreciate you telling us that you hacked somebody else's material.
That is a joke from the unmade Hans and Franz movie of SNL origins.
That's deep cut on that.
Well, if you're a podcast maniac like I am, you might listen to Conan O'Brien's podcast, where they are currently, as we record this, in the middle of a series of episodes in which they do a reading of the movie with Dana Carvey and Kevin Nealon and Robert Smigel. It's
My
fun.
favorite one of Conan O'Brien's has been the Paul Rudd, where again he brought was it Paul and Me? What's the movie? The aliens that he keeps showing.
Oh, that
the
movie
same
is
clip.
called
Something in Me. What is that? I can never write that down.
Not going to come up
The
with
alien's
a
name
bad
is-
E.T. ripoff, right?
Oh, it's a totally bad E.T.
Yeah.
ripoff. But I love that scene where he brings it in there, and Conan O'Brien is like, I can't believe I keep falling for that.
Yeah.
The steepled fingers methodology is this. If you add steepled fingers into anything, it automatically makes it evil, like I can say. Today I'm wearing peanut butter and jelly socks, for instance.
Okay.
Okay, that's important. But if I say, I'm wearing peanut butter and jelly socks, No consequence, right?
Okay.
But I want to add some steeple fingers in here. You tell me
Let's
how
see.
much evil this is. I'm wearing peanut butter and jelly socks today.
I get what you're saying.
see it?
I think that statement wasn't quite
No. I'm saying you could say anything.
down the middle enough. You got to have
I got
something.
it even more mainstream.
Peanut butter and jelly socks is too cute.
Okay.
It didn't work for me.
How about I'll say it? I love this brown table. Is that
That might be better.
that's more middle? Okay, so let's try it again.
Okay.
I love this brown table.
Mm-hmm.
There's your standard. I love this brown table. You see, I'm gonna put a little vial off of a ring into your cup of coffee there. I guarantee you that's gonna happen. That's a strange little thing. We talk about our own biases.
Right. So there's those biases that people have about who looks like a criminal, and there's a lot of racial stuff going on there as well, of course. A lot of racial stereotyping in that process. But where I usually work is not quite in the social cognition area. I think a lot about the biases we have internally about our own memories. So there is one side to are you good at faces, which is if you've seen someone before, will you recognize them? But then there's this other side to that same task, which is if the criminal's not there, do you have the sort of internal bias measuring processes to recognize that and to confidently reject the lineup? Some people do and some don't. So right when I was getting into grad school, the folks in my lab were working on this. A guy named Justin Cantner was working on a series of studies in which he tested people's memory for very different stimuli. So in one study, he used words, just a simple study, and then test paradigm. So you'd see a bunch of them, see a bunch of words, and then you'd see a bunch more words. And the task in the second half was which of these was on the first list. Then he did another study with the same people with paintings, lesser known works of famous artists. He did a face version, and then he did a version where they were exposed to Korean melodies. And these were mostly people who weren't Korean, who hadn't heard these melodies before. And so across all four of those different stimuli, there was a meaningful relationship between people's internal likelihood to pick their chooseriness, or we call it response bias. I'm trying to think of a more understandable word than that. But their likelihood to say yes, essentially, on the test. So here's a word. Is this word in the list that you just studied a minute ago? Yes or no? Well, some people say yes a lot more often than other people. And that pushes your accuracy around, right? Because in all these tests, half of them are words that you've seen before and half are not, or pictures or melodies. And so people have higher and lower general accuracy scores, but you can break that down into, do they pick correctly when it's there, and how likely are they overall to be saying yes versus no? And so that's a type of bias that is new on the scene, kind of as a thing we know is different between and among people, and something that is sort of that's a big thrust of half of my dissertation. Is that using that in an eyewitness sense. And it turns out it is reasonably predictive. We got, for the mathy people out there, we got correlation coefficients ranging from like 0.3 to 0.45 or so, which
What does
is
that mean?
not bad for psychology. A correlation is a measure of how closely two variables move together. So an example of a perfect correlation is the number of steps you've taken and the distance you've traveled, as long as your steps are reasonably consistent.
Gotcha.
Correlations can be positive or negative also. So that would be a perfect positive correlation, steps taken and distance traveled. Miles driven and gas left in the tank would be a perfect negative correlation, because as you go, the gas reduces.
So closer to 0 is a better outcome, or closer to 1?
1 is better.
The 1 is like a
Like
complete
perfect correlation. Yeah, the number of steps I take and the distance I've traveled is probably a correlation of 0.99, almost 1.
Okay.
And
Unless you're walking on a treadmill.
then it would be a meaningless graph, right? Which would depend on what you defined as the x or the y, but it would either be undefined or 0, or a flat line. But an example of a correlation near 0 is something like hair darkness and income is an example I use in class. So if you imagine a scale going from really light to really dark, and then income going from 0 to whatever, there's not going to be any relationship there. People with darker hair don't make more money.
I thought you were going to come back and say people that have gradually graying hair should be making.
Oh.
Because I'm in absolute agreement with that.
Okay, so let's say
this is going grayer.
That's a good point. So let's say I'm talking about hair color before it started turning gray, if it has.
I was kind of a redhead.
Okay.
So
you'd be kind of toward the lighter side on that hair scale.
Of no earnings.
Down by near 0.
That's where that's been for a long time.
Yeah. But that's an example of something that's not really related, right?
Yeah.
So
you talked about a really cool thing. Last time I was talking with you, you talked about this thing of almost implanting memories into somebody. Mm-hmm. And what was that example that you gave?
Well, we talked about really closely. This is closely related to that idea of context in memory, and Keegan-Michael Key making your wife think that she really wanted a glass of milk when she didn't.
Both thought it, yeah.
So here, how about I will say to you a list of words right now, and anyone listening could try this as we go.
All one listener, yeah.
And so I'll say the list, I will stop then, and then I'll ask you a couple of follow-up questions of words.
Okay.
Say, do you remember this word or that? Was this in the list or not?
I'm ready.
Okay. Bed, doze, deer, awake, dream, pizza, sheets, cows.
Okay.
We're pausing.
I'm with you.
Okay. Did I say deer?
Yes.
Did I say bed?
Yes.
Did
Sure.
I say dog?
Oh my God. I no.
Did I say sleep?
Yes.
Did I say pizza?
Yes.
Okay. So, you got all those right but one.
Did you say dog?
I did not say dog.
So why would I have thought?
No reason. I wanted to give you I gave you a couple of definite yeses and a definite no. And then I gave you the critical one, which was that I said a bunch of words around the idea of sleep, but I didn't say sleep. And so probably about 50% of people watching, if they...
Wait a minute. You didn't say sleep?
I didn't say sleep.
And
rewind the tape.
Did you ask me if I said...
I asked you if I said sleep, and you said yes.
So help me God. You said sleep, Mario. There is no way.
Is it
that easy to put...
I said bed, awake, doze, rest, sheets, lots of things that make you think about sleep, but not actually sleep. Yeah, so...
Am I that easy to manipulate?
It's the same...
I know I am, but...
We all are. It's the same thing it's the same example as the milk example from before. So they call this the DRM paradigm, named after the people who came up with it, Deese, Roediger, and McDermott. Deese originally came up with the idea in the 50s and used it as a classroom example for a long time, and then Roediger and McDermott brought it back to life in the 90s as an area of research. But essentially... it takes advantage of this networked nature of our memories. So memory is, again, this series of activations and sort of connections between concepts and things like that. So what I did is I said a bunch of things that reminded you of the idea of sleep, but I didn't say sleep. But all the nodes connected to sleep were really active. And so the sleep node was also very active, even though it wasn't specifically said. So it's a very natural thing. And you know what? In most of our daily life, the situation is probably going to be that we need to think of the idea of sleep when we hear all these words around the concept
that
of
makes
sleep,
sense.
right?
It's tied together.
It's all tied together. And so if someone is talking about all kinds of related ideas, it is sensible and good for you to come up with other related things.
The dog one, I struggle with the dog, but I was definitive on sleep. definitive
Yeah.
that I heard you say that.
That's also a
We're
common.
going to replay that tape, John. There's just no reason for that.
There's a common. That's a common feeling. So generally in the research, about 50% of people falsely remember sleep, and all of those who do are really, really confident that it was there.
That is a fascinating.
Is it 50%? Let me say that again. In the research,
I'll believe whatever you
many
say.
of the people
Apparently.
who do this kind of thing remember the word sleep. I want to say that it's about the same number as who remember actual words on the list, just about as often. That's more accurate. And the ones who do are very confident that it was there.
That's fascinating. I tell you what, I know you got a lot going on this summer.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're going to travel to Goshen, Indiana. You got some big travel plans coming up here pretty soon. All over the
Tri-County area.
Tri-County metro area, Fort Wayne.
I was in Layotto.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised you made it back.
It's wild.
That's just a maze of corn out there. Well, that's not that time of the year then.
No, it's not.
Get
It was
September,
all-
October.
it was all short.
You're not coming back from that. So don't go to Layotto in October.
Got
I
it.
guess that's the case in point.
Make a note.
Fascinating information on memory, and really the whole idea about the lineup and how biases can work against you or for you in a lot of ways. Fascinating stuff. And I swear to God, you said sleep. I'm just saying. I feel like a Milgram experiment person that's been involved in this, been tortured through that, and I'm probably not going to lose a lot of sleep with this.
Yeah, well, luckily there's an IRB on campus to keep us away from some of that, but I didn't consult them before I just manipulated your mind.
That's
so.
it
Oh, wait a
happens
minute.
all the time.
Sleep was on the list.
You see how that works? You use the steepled fingers, it's evil. You don't really need so much the steepled fingers, though, to add evil. Dr. Mario, I appreciate you coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Have a good day.
You too.